Did said I was 3 minutes late. Perfect. All right, so no adjustments to the agenda. Any audience and communications? We're moving. See, we're back on time. Okay. So now 4.0 presentation. Now that you've had a chance to just sit down, we're going to have a presentation on world language.
And now we are doing world language.
Bonsoir, buenas tardes. You know some people out there. So we are the world language teachers, some of the world language teachers from the district. And first of all, we thank you for inviting us tonight to talk about our program. So we'll start by introducing ourselves and let you know how long we've worked in the district. I work at Charlotte. I have taught French. Currently, I'm just doing Spanish, and I have been there since 1996. Tika Netherwood.
I'm Ginny Mimo, and I teach Spanish at Williston. This is my 21st year at Williston.
I'm Deb Laskraszewski. I teach French and Spanish at Williston, and it's also my 21st year, but I was hired a month before her, so.
She was.
I'm Megan Kelly. I started the Spanish program at Shelburne 8 years ago.
I'm Zalfa Casti. I'm teaching French at Heinsberg, and I'm completing my 17th year.
And I'm Agnes Thomas, and I teach French at Shelburne Community School, and this is my first year at that particular school.
So this is a list of all of the K-8 language teachers in the district. And this is what we offer at each of the schools.
Need to pause heavily on this slide so that everyone can read it. For a good reason.
Well,
Take all the time you need.
jump in that we're gonna, next month, we're gonna be taking, I was putting together a chart that shows, compares all the schools for all the EA subjects, so we shouldn't spend too much time on this week, because we're gonna do it a month from now, with everything, okay?
Well, that's the school with the purple curve all the way to the right. That's all I was saying for. Well,
So equity throughout is what we're highlighting.
yeah, as long as you're in 6th, 7th, or 8th grade. So.
Let us, we're ready. Okay.
So we're not sure if you're familiar with what ACTFL stands for. It's the the American, not association, the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages. It's been around, I don't know, a long time, 25, 30 years. And about 20 years ago, they put together national standards for learning a second language. And they called it the 5 Cs. We think for most language learners, the communication part is really at the heart of it. But everything else is connected, the cultures, the connections with other cultures, comparisons between cultures and countries, and then communities. And they've revised it a little bit. Nowadays, they are working more on what they call can-do standards, which are world readiness standards. What can you actually do with the language you learn? And that ties into our common targets right here in our district.
Need like my little target. I actually searched for that. I know, right? So we were given the opportunity over the course of the past academic year to meet as a district world language department, I think 3 or 4 times for a good chunk of the days in pre-service and post-service. And this is what we kind of shook out as our CVSD common world language targets that also align with the graduation standards for language acquisition. So this also involved our 9-12 colleagues, because we just want to make sure that we're sending them prepared to be as successful as possible when they come to CVU. And these focus on communication. And it's, again, speaking back to the I can statements that Tika was just referencing, which have their roots in ACTFL. Okay, and this is a snapshot of one set of common assessment scales that we will use in a world language classroom. We focus on communication, grammar, vocabulary. If we've had any of your children or currently do, I'm sure you hear about how we pound grammar into their cute little heads. And this is just one way that we're going to look and see if they're meeting their standards.
So there were far too many benefits of language learning to list on this slide, but a few. Learning a different language really helps with English acquisition. Learning not just the structure of your own language, but we work a lot with recognizing roots of words, and so it really does help with standardized tests. Colleges require languages. It has been shown to improve memory, and global citizenship is so important. We work really hard on showing that language and culture are inextricable from each other, and that students have a much greater understanding of the world around them and how they fit in culturally. So it really does improve, I think, their attitude about the world around them. Definitely higher reading achievement and achievement on standardized tests. And lots of other stuff.
So our goal by the end of 8th grade is that our students are at the novice mid to novice high level, proficiency level, and this is determined by ACTFL, the American Council of Teaching of Foreign Languages. So what that means is that our students can carry on conversations, ask and answer questions around familiar topics, that they can read short texts, they can write about their family and their friends and themselves, and use combinations of learned phrases and sentences.
Well, talking about how language and culture are really connected, so students have that exposure of culture projects and involvement. So they've been attending field trips to the Flynn, community services, dance and music workshops, organizing international fairs, having guest speakers over, sampling food and having fiestas, engaging in cooking activities about cultural dishes, art projects, as you can see in the pictures, having the opportunity to connect with pen pals abroad, and participating in the Vermont Foreign Language Association poster contest, and that has been really a great success.
So students in the language class are exposed to diverse learning experiences. We often use conversation and games and movements, interviews and role plays to involve our students. We often also borrow from our friends who teach math and social studies and arts, music, to involve our students in different subject areas. Sometimes when it's needed, we like to use technology so that students are engaged in different ways in our classes. Teachers of foreign language feel that it's very critical for our students to be engaged in global awareness and cultural diversity. We feel that it's important for the students to start to understand how different they are from people from other cultures, and how similar also they are, so that they become more open-minded and hopefully it leads to a more peaceful society. And finally, we like to involve our students in projects that they sometimes complete either on their own or in groups, and we have fun in the classroom this way.
In closing, would like to show you a video put by Heinsberg students that shows you the overall spectrum of learning another language from 1st through 8th grade. If you don't mind putting a full screen.
I think the green cords on both is dangling.
One moment.
Did we mention teaching language is about flexibility?
Start to
right.
sing. We should sing Solina Pizza. This sounds like pizza.
Oh, we just did that.
Is it coming out of the computer?
No, it is coming out here. Just on the web.
Can't hear it.
What if you stick it in the headphone jack? I hear it. We can show what's up with sound.
What we're missing is the students narrating about their own experiences.
And they sound adorable.
Try one more.
Brendan, you got your Beats by Dre speakers in the bag there, or? No, no? Didn't bring back this weird.
That sounded promising. Noise, Meg. No, we can show the pictures.
Well, maybe what we can do is play it as is, and then we could actually share it out with you all to watch another time.
Let you get on with your, no.
Yeah.
You want to imitate the students, the narrative?
Maybe not.
My teacher's the best teacher ever.
I thought this was Ryan.
We might have to improvise.
We're all part of a global community, Jeff.
Touche.
What's up?
All right, why don't we just let it,
Yeah, we
Okay.
can just share
we'll
it.
let it play and then we'll share it out.
Okay, thank you. Sorry.
There's, it's a little bit.
Snafu.
Let's see.
It's not your fault.
There you go.
experience.
If you have any questions, we'd be happy to answer.
I have a question. All kids K-8 or in middle school have to take a foreign language?
It depends on the
Depends on
school.
the school.
Depends on the school. And do we have any sense of how many kids take foreign language 5-8 versus when they get to the high school?
I don't know about versus high school. We did, you had some,
Yeah, for our school, but not versus the high school. I'm not sure what that statistic.
So we don't know.
We have a
If there's
pretty
a
high
drop-off or-
continuation rate, if that's what you're asking.
Right, right.
Yeah. I-
some change languages and some, most continue on in their language and some try a different one.
Yep.
Or even take two.
But the goal is for students to go into level 2 at the high school.
So those who are taking foreign language at the end of 8th grade will take some language at the high school?
Generally
Yes.
speaking, yes, they
Okay.
will choose to.
I have a question, and I would just preface this by saying I imagine that we would all agree that each student is unique, but some of our schools historically have been able to start foreign language early on, and some have not been able to do that. And I'm just wondering if there's a grade at which you think it's imperative that a student at least begin so that, on average, most students will then, let's say by the time they move through high school, will have been able to really master that language as much as possible.
Neurologically speaking, the zone of proximal development for language acquisition is typically age 11 to 12, the onset of puberty and younger. That said, adults actually have an easier time learning grammatical structures because they have pre-existing syntax. So it's really, communicatively speaking, you can learn language at any age. Obviously, the younger, the better. But that does not mean that the child that starts in 6th grade is going to be at a disadvantage entering college or university level studies versus the child that started in kindergarten. Because, everyone's brain is wired differently.
It also depends how much the contact time that the students have. So somebody who starts in kindergarten but gets like 20 minutes a week versus the person who starts in 4th grade and gets even 30 minutes 3 or 4 times a week. It's not just about the age, they need a sort of continuous contact time.
Right.
What did ACTFL recommend?
But also about the attitude, whether the younger they start, because in Harrisburg we start them in 1st grade, and we've completed few cycles now. The younger they start, they stay in the language, and the attitude towards learning it and sounding it, it gets embedded in them, and it's not like they're having that attitude, oh, how I'm gonna sound. So, and it creates that continuity for them to continue at the high school.
Yeah, and I was just going to hop in there. I think that we definitely, provided it's a quality program and there is enough contact time, we definitely want to get them as young as we can because they're so open and excited at that time, and their pronunciation is likely to be more accurate when you start before puberty. As Deb was saying, ACTFL suggests that students take a language 3 or more times a week, and it's a continuous study throughout, so they're not switching as they go along. So all of us have had different scenarios at our school, and for some have worked really well, and for other ones have worked well. But I do think capturing them when they're young and enthusiastic and open is really important.
Well, one thing I've seen at Charlotte, where we used to have it only 6 to 8, and then about 8 years ago, the Spanish program came in, was that the younger they are, we used to have K, then we cut it till 1st grade, now we have 2nd grade, and as you know, that's being cut next year. The younger they are, the more they are little mimics, and the accent, they'll sing songs, sometimes they don't know what they're singing, but they can sing those songs perfectly. Then you get them in 7th and 8th grade, and they're very self-conscious. They don't want to look like, oh, I'm trying to pronounce this properly. I'm not going to impress the teacher. So they get more analytical. If they look at a piece of writing, they try to sound it out by their English training, even though they know how to pronounce it. And they also get, as I say, self-conscious. The same little kids that will dance and sing, in 8th grade, as a teacher of 8th graders, I'll put on the songs and they will just stand there. So they won't sing, they won't dance. Because it's, you know, they're going through different things in their lives. So in terms of the language class, though, it's a great loss. Because, okay, now they can maybe conjugate in the preterite, but that, as you said, as we were all saying, that liveliness, that excitement, that natural approach is ebbing at that age.
Does it matter what language you teach? Like if you were teaching Chinese or German or it's French or Spanish, it doesn't matter, it's all the same, so.
You mean in terms of development, or what do you mean?
When you start it.
No, I don't think it matters. I mean, having different structures, Germanic languages are different than the Romance languages, are different than some of the tonal languages. I guess I'm not sure I understand your question.
Well, we just seem to have French and Spanish, we've always had French and Spanish in the K-8s. We've never expanded beyond that. Is there a reason for that? Is that because those are easier for the kids to learn at that age?
No, I think any offering would be a quality offering.
Any other?
Just one. So how are the classes conducted? Are they total immersion, like the teacher is speaking in French or Spanish throughout the session towards the end? For example, 8th graders who have been in that, Spanish class. So does the teacher tend to speak only Spanish so that kids can try to relate, or?
I think it depends on what's appropriate. I'm much less likely to try and teach the subjunctive in Spanish than I am English, because it's a very difficult, structurally speaking, it's a nightmare. But I'm not gonna lie. It's as appropriate. I know I can only speak for myself, but it's a progression. You hear a lot less English in my classroom with my 7th and 8th graders than you do my 6th graders at the beginning of September. And it's for them to try on stuff too. And as their writing progresses, a lot of times it's what fits you right now is appropriate. If you can write a paragraph and 80% of it's in English, but you use Spanish in there appropriately in context, that's okay. It's like growing into your clothes, you get there. We don't look at our babies when they're born and expect them in 6 months to be speaking in sentences. Some children don't speak until they're 2 or 3 years old, but that does not mean that they're not developing receptive language skills.
Right, it's very normal to spend a long period of time where there is the focus on the receptive. That's really important. It's not just instantaneous if they can talk. So the more input they have, the better that will be. I know at our school, we do a lot of immersion activities and time periods, especially in 7th and 8th grade. I think other people do that as well. Sometimes when we're doing something more cultural, some of that might be in their first language, because that's really important for us, that we're also developing the global citizenship piece. So it really depends what we're doing, but definitely it progresses as you go along.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate that.
And please let us know if you have additional questions about language learning, resources, things like that. We'd be happy to share those with you.
Email us. We're talkative people, that's why we teach language.
Thank you. Okay, 5.0 reports to the board. 5.1 committees, communications, community connections, 5.1. Do we have anyone from the communications committee here? Or, yeah, Dave's here.
I was there. So most of our meeting, we talked a lot about the open rec and the hiring that was going on, and just, I think folks on the communications committee just wanted to understand the interaction of the communications portion of the job description. I think it was a really great conversation. I think 3 people on the communications committee learned a lot, and Erin was, she did. She was very quietly not admitting that she was on the communications committee. But we did talk about articles that were gonna come up, and we did talk a little bit about the school resource officer. We're not gonna write an article about that just yet, but we're gonna have a conversation about it today, so hopefully we'll write an article about it later. And that's what I remember. full disclosure. Does that sum up the conversation you remember? Yeah. All right. I yield to the finance committee.
Okay, finance, budget, facilities. We spent a bit of time covering financial controls and procedures. It was riveting, and if you want more detail. I'd just like to say my whole committee is here, because we were so riveted by those financial procedures. If you want more information on that, Jean actually has quite the spread diagram of how it all works. But rest assured, we're in really good shape on how things are done. And it was nice to see it all laid out. We also talked a little bit about the year-round budget model that we're going to share in just a little bit. And then we talked a little bit about the three issues that we wanted to dig deeper on, which are the class size, the intervention framework, and the essential arts. And we're going to be doing the intervention framework and the class size, trying to get a sense of what it was that we wanted more information about. So that was finance. HR?
So we talked about the upcoming negotiations and trying to figure out, and at some point we'll probably have to have some executive sessions about some of these things. One of the challenges in this round of negotiations is that both of the teachers and the support staff contracts are expiring at the same time. Historically, they've tended to be, kind of off. One was off cycle of the other, so you wouldn't have both of them coming due at the same time. So we spent some time talking about that. I think the HR committee and Mark are all on board with rehiring the counsel that we used last time to represent us. Have you had a chance to reach out to him? So I think he's probably on board. So it'd be Pietro Lynn, and at some point we'll need to get the full board to kind of formally approve that. But he did a nice job for us last time. There's various committees that we're supposed to be meeting with as a result of the last contract. Mark is working on pulling those together. We spent some time talking about leadership development and succession planning and how we as a district can be doing more of that and kind of put together some programs on that. We hope to talk more about that at the upcoming retreat, the 2-day-long retreat.
Now it's 3.
All within one day.
Yeah. We talked about, we had had a committee, and this goes back probably 10 years at this point, where we looked at kind of our leadership team, our leadership structure, how they were paid, and try to come up with a system so that it was done equitably across the district, and there was a rationale behind it. That has been updated once, is my understanding, and we felt like that's probably something we're going to want to update again. We like the structure. It's just that every now and then you need to look at it, make sure that the numbers still work. Spent some time talking about the committee's charge in construction, and finally whether or not, for those of you who are not as immersed in the contract and its various terms, whether we should spend some time educating the full board on that. I'm not sure where that'll go, whether we'll have time for that or whether it's really a valuable use of time, but we spent some time talking about that as well, so. Pretty much it. Jeff, anything I missed, or?
I think you covered it very, very well, Russ.
Thank you.
So you mean that, when you said the contract in that last phrase about the construction contract?
No, nothing to do with that,
Oh.
just the teachers and the non-teachers
Construction,
contracts.
oh, okay, all right.
We want nothing to do with construction. You
I
can have
didn't,
that.
okay, I was confused there. I thought I heard the word construction and then, okay.
Okay, 5.2, Cole.
So, I have in my kudos a piece around Williston Central and CBU being selected by the CCSSO, which is the Council of Chief State School Officers. That's the group of people that are the secretaries and commissioners of education in our country. a subset of them are coming to Vermont as part of their innovation lab network. And they are visiting, it turns out, 3 districts, and asked if they could visit CVU and Williston Central. Also visiting a school in Burlington and a school in Winooski. And it's really an honor to have been selected for that. So they're looking for innovation in the areas of personalized learning, in proficiency-based learning, and in social emotional learning. And so when each of the districts were given once they agreed, they were given, here's our charge, this is what we're looking for here. So design a 2 to 3 hour visit, 20 people from across the country in each of the schools. And another point of pride related to that is, as you know, the Secretary of Education resigned. Obviously, she would have been the person welcoming these people at the big reception that they're having tomorrow night at the Echo Center. And Adam got an email from the coordinator, I was copied out of courtesy, and saying, you know, since Rebecca's not here to do the welcoming, might you have some students? And so it'll be CVU students who will be doing the welcoming tomorrow night. So I think that's something to be proud of, for sure.
So they're going to be doing a speech to the...
I'm going to go myself and find out. Yeah, they're going to be welcoming the dignitaries who are there.
That's great. I was worried they were going to try and snipe Adam Bunting from a leadership position.
Don't worry, I've got him
Gonna have
tethered.
him
He's
sign
going to
a-
be there, too.
sign a document for it.
Yeah. Megan, maybe you could do a little update on the University of Kansas study that it looks like we're going to be participating in?
So similar to honors for some of our schools, 2 of our schools, Williston schools, both, and Charlotte were nominated and sort of unofficially we found out that accepted to be model sites for a project called SWIFT out of the University of Kansas, which is about implementing multi-tiered system of supports, but focusing specifically on how schools support students with low incidence or significant disabilities. So they had a big team of people at the very last minute, so they had to sort of scramble, but come and observe and interview leadership teams and teachers and principals, and so it's pretty exciting to be part of that. Kansas will work with them. They're basically there to learn from our site. I think we don't know a lot of detail yet, but next fall, folks from both schools will be asked to present at a conference. And so it's sort of unfolding, but it's pretty exciting.
Thanks. And Jeff, might you tee up the work that we're doing around continuous improvement?
Sure.
Plan and the role that the board might play?
Sure. So a couple months ago in the COLT report, I shared that for the first time, the state has a new accountability requirement called a continuous improvement plan. And our first district plan was due April 1st, and we have submitted that plan. We had a design team from LEAD, so representatives from each school, administrators working on this. And now that it's been submitted to the state for feedback and ultimately approval, we had a conversation at COLT today about how to engage the board in that next step, and decided it would be wise for us to ask for a small group of board members to volunteer to become pretty smart about that particular plan, so that when we share it with the whole board, we've got a group who's pretty familiar with it, and so that we can share the priorities that we've identified in terms of moving forward, and then ultimately seek board approval. So if anybody is interested in doing that, what I'm thinking is to start maybe like a 2 to 3 hour block of time to meet with me and hopefully some of our design team members within the next month. So if you're interested, if you could just send Lynn an email of interest, and then Lynn will pass those names on to me, and we'll make that happen.
The initial timeframe is 2 to 3 hours this month. What do you see long-term for
If people still want some more time with it, then we can arrange that, but I think initially we'll just use it to share our thinking and get some feedback, and then decide, and ask those folks, do we think we're ready to now inform the board about it?
Is this something that either Tom or Kyle might be? So if you guys are interested, either one of you, to spend that time with Jeff.
Always welcome a student
I'm just
perspective.
thinking that perspective might be interesting. And finally, the most interesting piece of all, Jean.
I feel sarcasm from this.
I'm just kind of feeding off your own sarcasm. IT security.
I thought you were talking about electric buses, but
That's
no, that's more fun.
You can talk about that, too.
That's true. The IT security, just to update for the board, so we have implemented this two-factor authentication. Honestly thought it would be a lot of pushback from staff, and we got very little pushback. I think we just turned that corner in the world where people understand it's necessary, and they're already doing it maybe with their bank or something. So we haven't had too much trouble with that at all. We've kind of moved on to our next push is phishing. So that's where you get an email that looks legit, and you click on something, and it turns out to not be legitimate. Mike Canfer has been working on a training. I'd rather say a training than a test because we don't intend to gather data on individuals, but what this would be is an email that goes out to the staff, and when they click inappropriately because they don't pick up the clues that we put in there, it'll just tell us how many people clicked on it, and then how many people not only clicked on it but put in information. You know, that's kind of the big no-no. It'll just give us some numbers. It's really for us, this first time through, it's really just to see if the email, the blogs and the notes that we're trying to get out to the staff are having an effect. So, I don't know, has anybody here ever gotten caught with one? I know at IBM we used to do these phishing tests. I know, Russ, you did too, right?
I haven't gotten busted on it yet. I know people who have.
Only once, right?
And I also know people who clicked on things that, you know, they shouldn't have. They weren't even phishing tests, and man, does IT go nuts. So it's pretty serious stuff.
Right.
And it's good that we're testing.
Yeah. I think just doing it and realizing that you did it makes you really aware going forward not to. It does. And then last but not least, there are sort of, if you pay attention to the news, I think was it Atlanta that got caught in this big ransomware? Like the whole city got caught in this massive ransomware, which is where they take all your data and they say, if you don't pay us, we destroy it. So just want to let everybody know that we do have backups to all our data, and it's refreshed constantly and tested to make sure that we can retrieve things. So we aren't, we are immune to.
We're not at risk.
We're not at risk on that one. So lots going on. We're really lucky to have Mike Canfer with us because he's quite the expert, and he's actually being pulled in at the state level on the hosted services work. So we're lucky to have him.
Any questions about any other part of the report?
I have a question about facilities.
Mm-hmm.
I see that there's discussion about the projects that are earmarked for this summer. I didn't see anything about any renovations related to security, and I'm just wondering if those discussions are going on, if there are any
Oh, that's a great
plans
question.
related to that.
So in our original plan, we had a couple. I mean, we've been, I have to say my predecessor did a great job of being on top of security. So we don't have, in my mind, we don't have any huge glaring issues. We've got a couple of new ones. I think if you ever come into CVU in the front door now, we probably have to do something rather than have a table, watching there. We have to do something at the front entrance. There's other projects here and there. So we had a couple of them just as normal course of business, but it looks like the state may be offering up some funds that we can match. We'll be able to do a little bit more. So we certainly been working with Kurt and the facilities managers to sort of identify what those projects are, prioritize them, and also we'd have to drop something else off, right, of our list. But we are going through that. It's a great question, Jeff.
But it does look that even in the latest legislative update, that the money for school safety, construction money for school safety, $25,000 per school, is still, in the hunt.
So it's not assured.
Not yet.
Not assured, but.
Not yet.
Yeah.
Is that 25,000 per building or 25,000 per district?
I think it's per,
it's per school, yeah.
Per school. So I don't know if they would say ABS and WCS are two schools. I think so.
I think so.
Yeah, per school.
They're two schools.
And can you just, it made me think when you talked about security, there was the VT Digger report that said that 2/3 of all Vermont schools were not E911 compliant.
We are compliant.
We are.
But we are running.
All of our schools. Yeah.
Is that the landline?
E911?
In the building, I assume that's what that refers to.
I think so.
It's, if there were a call from this room, the 911 dispatch would know that the call came from this room, and not just CVU.
That's only on that phone, not
when Right.
somebody calls on their cell phone.
Oh,
No, I don't think that'll work.
Right.
Come on,
It's, yeah.
Not yet.
Eventually maybe, but yes, no.
That's right.
Like Pompeo knows it's you calling, but nobody else does.
Good grief. Okay, we're, principals report, 5.3. Are there any questions on the principals report? No? Okay, Thomas, Kyle, you're up.
Sure. So I'll start with a couple weeks ago. We had the day off of school for freshmen, sophomores, and juniors to have their PLP meetings with their advisors, which went very well, I assume. Our spring sports season is ramping up, and I will personally say that our track team is looking pretty good this year. Recently, Thomas and I were included in a group of CVU students that was lucky enough to do some work on the upcoming profile of a graduate student for the state of Vermont. We worked with some people from the Agency of Education that came to CVU twice, actually, to do some work with us, which I thought was a really productive session. I don't know if all of you know this, but at CVU we have student hiring panels. So when potential candidates for teaching positions come up at CVU, not only do they interview with Adam and whatever other administrators, but they also sit down for a half hour with a group of students that volunteer to be there, and it's really great. We just get to ask them questions that we care about. They get to ask us questions, and it's then we can give our feedback to Adam. And on student council, we're working on a lot of stuff right now, but one of which is getting a better way for students to give feedback to their teachers on their how they're teaching. So we're hoping to get that implemented pretty soon.
So this is a pretty busy time of year for seniors with Grad Challenge, for one. So Monday and today were half days, so seniors can meet with their Grad Challenge reading groups and talk about their paper and make any revisions if need be. And then Grad Challenge presentation day is May 25th. So it seems like a while away, but it's actually just about a month. So seniors have also been away at the past, or on their own over the past week or so, going to mid-students days for different colleges. So we'll know by next month where our seniors are going after this year. In addition to teacher feedback forums on student council, this is Kindness Awareness Week, so we're working on just promoting a better community. Not saying that our community is bad, but just trying to make it even more of a cut above. So on Thursday, we'll be doing this big sticky note campaign, I guess you could call it, during student council in the morning, and we're really hoping that will cap off the week before break. Good spirit. Student ACT, which is the CVU Sexual Harassment Prevention Group, has been very active this month, as April is Sexual Harassment Prevention Month. They gave a presentation the first week of April, and last Monday they brought in Cindy Pierce, who is a well-known activist against sexual harassment, and gave a very well-received presentation to the entire student body. Next week is April break, and as I mentioned last meeting, with February break, there are 3 trips going out, one to Italy for Latin and AP Art students, the Denmark trip, which is the only trip that's majority sophomores, and that's an exchange program with our sister school in Denmark, and then there's also the Habitat for Humanity trip, where a group of students go to North Carolina to build houses.
You guys aren't busier. Just sitting around watching a screen, right? Thank you. Okay, 6.0 learning topic, 6.1 year-round budgeting. We don't have any music, so it's your turn. Or choices, except we don't have any screen either.
It takes a little while.
So,
Turn the lights down.
Probably, at least the ones on the front there. So what we're talking about, let me just recap. When we went through the budget, we had some conversations
as we prepared how we were going to do the budget going forward, to, rather than do most of the budget work in a 6 or 8 week period with decision packets and, tax all like coming at you all at one time, that it would make more sense to kind of stretch out the budgeting process so that the board has time to focus on what they want for schools, what their goals are for schools, what information they'd like for schools in a more thoughtful way before you get to the point where you're saying, and we have to cut $500,000, something like that, right? So it would be like, what are our goals? And then when we get into the fall, concentrate on the numbers more. So this is the part where we want to concentrate on the topics as opposed to the numbers. So what came out of the last budget, we're going to touch on that tonight. I would take you through a little overview, again, a reminder of how the budget's working, and then a couple of the ones, we had 3 different subjects. 2 of them we're going to touch on tonight, the intervention systems and the class size data. Go to the next one. So, a little hard to read, but this is just how we look at the budget through the year. A lot of prep work goes on in the summertime as we close up one year, the FMR, and the prior year, and the audit. Megan and her team put the entire special ed plan together. I think it's due in September, Megan? October 15th. That pretty much has to be done, so. That's right, darn. And then we update the equity and autonomy matrix, which we talked about a little bit, which is where our staff is by school and with student counts and things like that. So we do a lot of the prep work in the summer. When we get to the fall, you have the stakeholder input, which is not only stakeholders we think of as like community forums, but it's also when Elaine and I meet with the principals and do really some in-depth planning on what they need out of the budget. So that goes on in the background. Then we hit the subject, the point mid-November, which you guys were all really familiar with, and in 2 months we cranked through the numbers and the decision-making to get something put together so we have articles finalized at the end of January. Then an intense month of communications with the ending hopefully, knock on wood, vote on town meeting day. And then we get into what we're talking about today, which is we're coming around to getting started all over again, and we have what we're calling goal development. So the point of all this is to deep dive on relevant education topics which inform next year's budget development work, and we do some goal setting. So these are the 3 that we have kind of extracted with the finance committee, and I think we talked about it at the full board last time too. The topics being, what is equity? That discussion we have penciled in for the 3-day board retreat. Now it's 4.
The next one is, this came out of the last, the early December budget meeting when Elaine took the board through we call it the regular ed part of the presentation, and we talked about intervention systems. It showed some what could be perceived as inequity, and Megan and Elaine and Jeff have been doing a lot of work on that. So that's what you're going to see in a minute, is the status on that. And remember, just to keep in mind, the intent of this is to say, are there budget-related questions we have? That's the point of this presentation. If there are equity or if there are intervention-related questions, I'm not going to tell the board they can't go there, but really what I need to leave this presentation with is there additional work that's budget-related that I need to do work on this summer? I'm going to touch on class size. We're going to talk about, the questions came up primarily around kindergarten, but I'm going to show you the class size numbers again. And again, I need to know from the board what they want to do with that information. Is there work, what work needs to happen between now and November on class sizes, if any, right? And finally was equity within the essential arts, and that I'm trying to pull something together for next month's board meeting. So next month, my intent is to be able to share with you across all the essential art topics what kids are seeing at all the schools and by grade. And again, as we look at the data, the board needs to say, okay, now I understand the data, what questions do I have, and what budget kind of work do we want to do before we get into the budget season next November? Okay.
So I'll just start talking with Jeff and Elaine. Obviously, this is sort of a group project, so they can feel free to jump in. So you've seen probably a version of this visual. Back last fall when we were wrapping our heads around how do we look at equity in our intervention systems, how are we providing services to kids in our schools. You've seen the guiding principles document several different times, so we were looking for a way to quantify what are the essential components of an intervention framework. And we did this sort of by looking at what we all currently have in our system. What are the different roles, how are they used, and how do they implement the guiding principles that we have. And so we've have this visual that talks about three parts of a high-quality instruction and intervention system. There's a component for implementation, a component for coaching, and kind of a foundational component of social emotional learning so that kids are ready to learn.
Can you back it up a minute?
Yep.
So I think it's important to say that when we started on this work, we had a sense that there were going to be some inequities. We had a sense that we were going to find some things that we were going to go, what are we going to do about that? But we weren't quite sure how we would frame it. So what you're seeing there is really nice, circle with three components, but it didn't start that way. It started with just imagine a whiteboard, like two of those whiteboards just plastered with every person in each of our systems that is doing some of that work, and then saying, what's the organizational structure now that's going to be illuminating to us? And that's how we got to that. So that represents, we had an inkling, we knew that we were going to find some things, but we didn't even have an understanding about how we were going to categorize it. I think that's important because it wasn't top down. It wasn't like Megan looked at the guiding principles and said, hey, we need and let's go see what we've got. It was like, let's see what we have, we're suspecting, and then from that came this. So really, bottom up.
So there are a couple slides in here that eventually Sandy can send out, but this is sort of what we mean when we talk about coaching and coordination. Our intervention system has a management component, kind of planning, scheduling, detail, logistics. There's a need for directing and developing the programming that's happening, supporting teachers' instruction and implementation, supporting professional development, implementing our assessment plans, and really a need to coordinate the district level work with school level work. So this is a component, and this is how we defined this part of it.
Without that, what you have is every teacher or every parent just doing what they think is the best thing. And everybody has the best intentions, but it's not cohesive, it's not coherent.
Right, exactly. Implementation, one of the things we knew coming into this is we all have different ways of implementing our intervention system, and our schools have different people providing those services. We also know that our most struggling learners need to be working with our highest, the people in our system with the most expertise. So there's very specific roles that professionals have in our intervention system and specific roles that support staff do have, a supplemental and a reinforcement role. So we knew that in looking at each school's model, we needed to look at to what extent are they implementing with both professionals and paraprofessionals. And social emotional learning, again, we knew coming into it, we had lots of conversation about, is this a component? Is this a foundational piece? And so, who knows if the visual might eventually evolve. But we know that our schools need to have a system of supports to make sure that kids are coming to school ready to learn. And if they're not coming to school ready to learn, how do we wrap around that? So there's a level of professional development for classroom teachers for all of our systems. Do we have the expertise to be able to really analyze students' behavior and create very specific plans? Do we have continuum of support for when kids actually need support from another adult? Do we have coordination of all of these systems? And, do we have curriculum and instruction that is teaching social emotional skills to our students? So this is a pretty foundational component. So once we sort of identified these three high-level components of an intervention system, we looked within each school, so each school is a closed system, what percentage, first of all, this top line is what percentage of the K-8 enrollment does that school represent? So Charlotte is, at the time, was roughly 14% of our K-8 enrollment, Heinsberg's 21, et cetera. And then in each of those areas, what percentage of their staff or their model or the way they organize things, what percentage is spent on coaching and coordination? What percentage is on implementation? What percentage is on SEL? And then the bottom shows cumulatively. So intuitively, you roughly want to get to a place where you're moving toward that bottom number aligning with the top number. So if you have roughly 14% of the population, you also should represent roughly 14% of the resources. At this first blush, there's lots of conversations that we can have around need and population and demographic and how does that impact this. So this is an ongoing project, and what you're seeing is the current, this chart actually shows you the first pass, which is where we were back in the fall.
And this does not, there's no intention there that there should be a third, a third, a third.
Correct.
Right? We don't know
Correct.
what that is. That's another project to figure that out. But, you know, when you go back to the definitions, we do know that you need enough of coaching and coordination to be able to do those things that we defined as the important work around that. But we shouldn't get tangled up about whether 32% in coordination and coaching for one school is the right number. But the bottom, you know, that orange block at the bottom compared to that yellow block at the top are the numbers that we were looking at and sharing with the entire admin team.
Megan, just because I got a little confused, the numbers are all this way. None of them, this way doesn't add up to 100.
Correct.
It's okay.
Exactly. They're not intended going up and down to add up to
Right.
100.
Right.
Good, thank you for pointing that out. So this information and kind of the detail below the information is what we brought to leadership teams individually in each of the schools, collectively as a lead team, back individually, and this kind of process of looking at the data, thinking about their systems. This is where we.
I'm just going to jump in
Yep.
one more thing, because that's exactly right. That whole iterative process was really important for where we ended up. But also that it's a closed system. So we were saying to everyone, we don't, the board isn't putting more money to this, and we're not asking them to. If we're going to make changes, they need to be made within the closed system.
Yep. And so the second column, that's just been.
Can I just ask a question?
Yep. Go ahead.
Because you said board. Was that because you felt like you had enough resources within the system to meet all of the need? Or was that because we said, we don't want you to go above this amount?
I'd say both. You know, we knew that we were looking at a 2.5% increase, right? But we also, I mean, there wasn't clamoring for having more necessarily. You know what I mean? There were certain, you will see, like between the first one and the second one, there were changes because people said, we need more of this. We don't have any professional level support in our implementation. Or we, school X, have this percentage of the population and only this percentage in this area, and it feels like, we do feel like we're short. So trying to make that work, in a way, I mean, it's possible that having that constraint helped us to really hone in on what we were really trying to do and make sure that there weren't changes that were made that weren't for the benefit of kids and weren't aligned with the guiding principles, for example.
So a couple things, and there's a lot to digest in this chart, but a couple of things that you can sort of see is, first, just looking at the very bottom line, schools, there was some shift in resources to kind of bring the cumulative into alignment, closer into alignment with that top piece. The other piece is, so if you look at Heinsberg under coaching and coordination, one of the things that they noticed is that their intervention system was lighter than they wanted it to be on people there to coordinate and manage the whole thing, and heavy on implementers. And so they made some internal decisions to shift that a little bit. So again, within a closed system. So just picking out a couple of examples, because there's a lot to unpack in that chart.
And there were also some shifts that were made between schools, and those were a little bit trickier, and we made sure that we met with the administration at both those schools to say, what is it that you hope to get out of this? So there are some things that some schools achieved that, absent this kind of work, they wouldn't have been able to achieve on their own. And so, in any one of those blocks, it could be that they traded one type of support for another because they felt like where their school is right now, this is what they really need. And we were surprised ourselves that that went as smoothly as it did.
Could you give a more specific example?
Yeah. So remember when last year and this year, when I did the EQS, and I showed that Heinsberg was really underserved in terms of, they did not meet EQS for school counseling. And then yet we had another school that had almost twice, not quite twice, but quite a bit more than they needed. So we just put that on the table and said, well, look at what we're looking at here. Without saying you have to change this now, but we're saying over time, something's going to have to give here, because we can't have Charlotte have, it started off, Charlotte had, 21% when they've got 14% of the population, and then you've got another school that's got 21% when they've got 36% of the population. So just within that area, Charlotte was the only school that didn't have a school social worker. And the administration really felt like, we need a school social worker. But we couldn't add anything. We were already looking at the school that had the most resources. And so we just put on the table, well, here are the numbers, here's what we see. And we imagine that in a 2 to 3 year plan, we're going to have to address both the education quality standards piece and the equity piece across the district. And so over time, and this was a lot of conversations, because there was nobody saying you have to do this. What ended up happening was that there was an opportunity this year. And I think that people looking at like, oh, if we make this happen this year, we can see where we'll end up. Feels a lot better than we wait and then it has to happen, and now we say, oh, now you're going to be who knows where, right? So I think that's a really good example. There were examples around, in every one of those areas, there were examples like that.
So they gave up or moved a particular
So, right, yep. So,
Coaching coordination is another example. If you see the
right.
Charlotte to Heinsberg, the original numbers, they've now shifted because we've moved some people.
So just to close that loop, because I'm bated breath, CCS got their social worker,
Yes, yep.
but we traded to get the social worker.
You traded CCS traded 0.5 of a school counselor. And so now they meet school EQS and Heinsberg. They all meet EQS now, so they're all within. And it's complicated, right? Because there isn't a principal, so we've got one right here. You're going to correct me if I'm wrong, but there isn't a principal who wouldn't say, yeah, we'd take another school counselor. Yes, we'd take another coordinator. Yes, we'd take another teacher. Yes, we'd take, right? So this is what I mean when I say in a little bit, the fact that we were saying this was a closed system because of that 2.5%, and we knew what that meant. Like, where do you find 2.3%? Where do we know where you find any cuts to that. If you want to go lower than 2.3, if we're not doing the work like this, then we're finding the people in our classrooms.
So can I just ask why this is just a K-8 and not a K-12?
So I think 912 has to be its own project, and Megan and I have talked about that, and I've talked about it with Adam too, because it's so different. Same areas, same main areas, coaching and coordination, implementation, social emotional learning, but to try to compare that across the system, the needs are just so different.
I think this is a natural comparison where we've got the same grade levels in
Right.
5 different buildings or 4 different systems. Sure, you could throw the high school in there, it'd be interesting to see just from a numbers
Right.
standpoint, recognize that their needs and their
Right.
work is different.
Right.
I guess it was the fact that the conversations happened and you realized things were, if that same opportunity had been afforded to 912.
Well, so 912 was also doing something else that either Megan or Jeff can talk about with the Great Schools Partnership, right?
Yeah, so, and I think we're actually soon to get our report from Great Schools, but through some of the grants that my office has that funds NTSS, CVU's been working with Great Schools Partnership on run a kind of a inquiry into their multi-tiered system of supports and what are the supports available to kids both within and outside of special education. And given that that work is happening, and it's very much in alignment with this, it felt like it would be useful to have that information before kind of diving into just the comparison piece.
We'll get smarter every time that we do this. There could be at some point that we will have a comprehensive, spreadsheet like this or chart like this that has CVU in it, and it'll all make sense, but it's not readily apparent to me how it would make sense right now.
And we have had conversations, though, that these three pieces are very much
Yes.
applicable at CVU. They need and have folks that oversee and coach and coordinate. They have implementers in their system, and they have a system of social emotional learning supports. But what that looks like at the high school level is very different. And I'd say, especially in the social emotional learning realm, how you support that in a 9 through 12
Yeah.
building is really different from how you support it. Okay.
I think if I could just go back to your example that you gave, I think that I can't imagine how difficult it is making these decisions in many respects because we're talking about moving people and the impact that it's having on students, et cetera. And, as I've expressed, I have concern about the loss of school counselor time at CCS because, in this time where the district has really embraced a trauma-informed approach, and we know that the heart of that approach is relationship. And when I look at a school counselor who's been in place for many, many years, and I think is phenomenally skilled and works across all grade levels and really has deeply embedded relationships with so many students, I think that impacts the culture of that school because of the wide-ranging activity and involvement that she has. And those positions are unique in some respects because of that versus, teachers who are in their own classrooms, et cetera. And so I do have some concerns about the impact to autonomy, if you will, of that culture. I fully understand the necessity to be seeking equity across all of our schools and the challenge of limited budgets, et cetera. But I also think that my understanding as the district moved toward a consolidated process was that there would be, if you will, equal attention to equity and autonomy. And I just think that this is one of those situations where autonomy, I believe, is going to be frankly deeply affected.
But here's the piece that you do need to know, that decision didn't get made by us, it got made by the administration at Charlotte. And when we talk about autonomy, that's what we're talking about, the local leadership at the local building. What's the extent to which they can say, this is what I need?
Yes.
Right, and that's tricky too, isn't it? But
Very
I
much
mean,
so.
we weren't the ones that were saying, this would be better than this, right?
And they have welcomed, we were to have met yesterday, and because of
Yes, I
illness,
heard
we
that.
couldn't,
Right.
we couldn't have that meeting. So I'll express this again, but I'm struck by how, when you move down into the weeds of this, how very challenging this process is, and I respect the effort that you've.
So I think the thing that I would want to say also, though, is that our intention in all of this always is better for kids, right? So it could be that, as we get deeper into this, I think we're so much smarter about this than we were in October. It's amazing to me, right? By really systematically analyzing all of this, I think we know a whole lot more about how the systems function. It's possible that in another year we'll look at it and we'll go, you know what, we thought this, but now the way it's playing out, we're wondering about it. And I mean, Jeff's in charge of continuous improvement for the school, because the state says we need one of these plans, but the fact is, I think that we are a continuous improvement system, and the improvement is about how can we better do our work for kids. So.
I could keep talking. I guess my question is, how are we going to know? If this is not a budget document, but it does have budget impacts, if it isn't working. So how are we going to know? How are we going to know?
But I think that's the
the part that you are giving to administration, right? And that's the discussion that'll happen in the fall between administration is if this new system we're finding holes, then the principals will work with Elaine to say, this is really important, a priority that we need to fill these holes. And that's what we'll bring back to the board to say, we know we're equitable, but either because of, as Megan said, maybe we're finding demographic issues that equitable isn't appropriate, and maybe it needs to be something else. Or that everybody needs to be a little more on something, and then that would be two things that would come back from the administration as a request to the board, for additional funding.
That's a really important piece, right? That equitable doesn't necessarily mean that everybody gets exactly the same thing. And so we've had conversations in lots of different venues around how is it that we currently address differential needs, either based on the disaggregated groups that we all know might need more support, but sometimes it's not about that. Sometimes it's a system that just needs support. And so in one way, that is how we support. Any one of us at the central office can think of a time when we've spent an inordinate amount of time in a particular building providing support to an administrative team because that's where it was needed. Whether it was around social emotional learning or it was about some other thing, that's one way. In special ed, it's totally based on the service plan, so the need is built into the way the process works. And Title I is another area. ELL is another area where the need the support goes where the need is. This is just an area that we do a comprehensive, systematic kind of framework around what's needed and based on EQS also, but.
But you're gonna make that decision based on EQS, but the feedback loop is the time constant is 6 months to a year. Based
Right.
on the performance in school and feedback and parent comments, teacher comments. It's not just the EQS.
No.
Right.
Right. Yep.
Excuse me, I'm not sure that as part of the consolidation, there was ever any representation that equity and autonomy were going to be treated equally. I think there was a commitment that there would be autonomy within certain boundaries perhaps. But I'm not sure that the two were really given equal. And I'm not sure they can, be treated equally. I'd also maintain that, this sort of thing, these deep dives into individual buildings is not the role of the board. That's why we have an administration that hopefully shares our values, and we should be hiring people who share our values. But we have to count on them to report back to us and to evaluate what's working and not working. In particular buildings, unless there's something that becomes a crisis at some point that, what is going on in individual buildings, on a policy board, is not really where we should be spending our time and energy.
So I would just want to clarify that meeting with the school principals and CCS, I will attend that meeting as a parent because I approach the changes that are coming from a parental perspective, and I've been very clear about that. So I fully understand the importance of being careful in this process.
I also think as a board, we need to allow the administration to move forward with changes that they think will benefit the students, but we also have to allow them to make mistakes and then be able to accept that as a board, because we are trying some things that we haven't done in the past.
Interesting discussion around outcomes too. What's the board's outcome goal on this topic? Because it's a hard one it's not quite like your math scores. It's a little harder to.
I have some ideas.
Okay, I bet you do. All right, so what I'm taking away, what I'm taking away on this budget topic is that the board is open to administration coming back with more information or new information if they feel necessary around additional needs or additional shifting of resources in the budget. But from the board, you're not asked this topic, you've got some comfort that the administration's got its arms around it?
Yes.
But
But it goes down to 7.2. I just have a question around, since we can't put school resource officers in every school, and the importance of the developing relationships, and that, and that's something new that has come up since we've done the budget, if that changes any of this.
Okay.
And that, I would throw that out there, because I think that would be something that the board might be interested in talking about, since we can't afford school resource officers.
Okay. So, topic number 2, which is class size. The concern was particularly around kindergarten, and so what we'd do here is refresh the board with some numbers, and then we're going to be asking like what the board wants to do moving forward. So this is the data that Elaine showed in December, but I just kind of simplified it, that's all. So it's got K3 and 4-8, which is what the EQS standards are, how they're defined, and then by school, what our numbers are for those grades. And then down below is specifically the kindergarten numbers, and what you see there, why they're crossed out, is the numbers that are crossed out are the numbers that we looked at from NESDEC, and the new numbers are our best estimate at what the numbers are really going to be now that the schools have had their kindergarten, whatever you call it, registration, thank you. They have another term for it, but.
Yeah, and a little asterisk there, because I know for sure that 2 of those schools that are listed there, those are the exact numbers that they had for registration last year, and then, when school started, they had 10, 12 more kids.
Well, all the numbers are, no, so the numbers there, for instance, Heinsberg has a lower number that actually registered,
Right.
but we added, like
Right.
last year, what the difference between their registration and their first day was, I added it to their current
Okay.
registration to the first day. So the numbers there are actually our best estimate.
Okay.
They're not registration numbers. So you can see that the numbers are, make a little more sense. You can also see that Williston got its 6th teacher because they have way more kids than NESDEC was saying, which is what we had in the budget for them. Shelburne had fewer. They were expecting 90. They don't even have 75 registered, but we added a couple to make it 75, so they'll have some nice small class sizes, CCS in the same boat.
Well, I just want to say, unless they get more.
Right.
Right.
I think you'll have.
So we're really
Small class sizes, not nice small.
Right,
That's
yeah.
good, fair enough.
So we are tracking that, and we've already spoken to the principals about doing kindergarten registration earlier next year so that we'd have a sense. But it turns out that there are definitely people in our communities who pretty much know that their kids can come to school even if they don't register in March, and they don't. So that's always going to be a squirrely number, and until we start keeping track of it to see year to year, what does that look like? I think we're always going to be in the situation where we're giving you our best, guesstimate about what the numbers are going to be.
What happens with Whispering Point if they go up more?
Yeah, what if like we go, is the EQS for kindergarten is how many in a class per teacher? 20?
It's not, it's K3, and it's less than 20 on average.
So but if we look at Williston being our biggest school, they would, could they get 12 more? I've already bumped the number up 7 or 8 from what they're registered, so I think they're.
Well, actually, we're at 112 as of today.
Really?
So we could be easily
Could be.
116, 120.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the issue, for argument's sake, if 10 fewer kids actually showed up in Shelburne, and you have 10 more kids in Williston, and ended up being 120, could you shift one person from Shelburne to Williston?
Yes, we could.
And, I think that's really, what the
wouldn't be
board
with-
should be
it wouldn't
looking
be
at and,
without its
and agreeing to with the administration is, what's the threshold that says, okay, Shelburne is now 12 kids per class. We're not gonna, we're just not gonna do 12 kids per class. And, we're not gonna go above 20 or
Yeah,
whatever
no.
it might be in Williston. I think those are the issues, and then what's our flexibility for, either
because we're-
shifting people around or hiring. I don't think we're in a position, given the contract and when we have to commit to people, you couldn't just say, okay, well, let's get rid of a teacher in
No.
Shelburne, that person's
No.
without a job. We're past that point where
Right.
you can
Right,
do that,
right.
even if you wanted to,
Right.
which I don't think we would, but even if we wanted to, you couldn't do it at this point. So where are those thresholds that you're actually shifting people from one building to the next?
So the point on this, though, was really a question around, did the board want to have a discussion going forward about class sizes being different than what
What their
the
policy
policy
says
says
now.
now, which is on the next page. You know, which essentially allows the superintendent, or tasks the superintendent with finding the right number within the EQS.
Can we go back to the previous screen? As I, again, without more numbers there, it's difficult to say, we don't know how many classes there are in CCS that, you get this 18.6. And if you eliminated just one position there, and, what does that take that number to? And of course, then you've got 4 grades within, within that number. So, just like, it's hard to do fractional kids, it's hard to do fractional teachers.
But is
So-
that the board's role?
So I will tell you that kindergarten is the only place where it's an issue, at this point anyways. I haven't heard from anybody anywhere that there's an issue anywhere else. It's kindergarten. We can count our kindergartners this year, and we know how many first graders, so we know pretty much the numbers that I showed you by grade level back in December. Those numbers are moving forward. There might be a few adjustments, but it's not a big thing. It's that kindergarten numbers, and it turns out ninth grade numbers are squirrely. We don't know. We think we know, and there's some pattern of how it changes year to year, but we don't know. So that when we're looking at this now, first of all, the fact that we're merged does allow us, if the numbers got lower than this, to say, okay, well, we need to move a teacher, let's say. Or, let's say you said superintendent, send a letter to the community of kindergarten children and say, welcome to CVSD, we're so happy to have your children in our school. It turns out we have a couple schools with very low kindergarten enrollment, might you be interested? So, could be somebody works in a community, it's just kind of an extension of preschool, and maybe they'd want to do that for a year. And that would give us time to think about, well, what does that look like then in the early elementary grades? Because if you're talking about our smaller schools, let's take CCS, this problem doesn't go away after this year, right? And I believe, having taught primary grades, that 15 is on the low end of a class size, right? In terms of what the interaction you want to do with kids, the social piece, I think that swings in numbers for teachers is a hard thing too. So it's not great to have a class of 15 this year and now you've got a class of 18 or 19 next year. Whereas if you'd had a class of 18, 19 every year, you'd figure out how to make that work. You'd say to your administration, there are the supports I need somebody to come in here and help put the boots on when the kids are ready to go out, or whatever it is. And you kind of like wrap a system around that. But when it goes back and forth, it can really, it's just.
So can I just maybe
Yeah.
direct the conversation a little bit, just to point out that, when we were talking about the intervention framework, the board basically said, we're willing to let the administration figure this out and recognize and come back to us if you need more. Is class size really any different?
No.
I mean, should we be dictating what it should be, or should we say, we're tasking the administration to, which is what our policy says, to come up with it as long as it meets these criteria, and if it doesn't, come back to us? Is that something that we want to change? Go ahead.
I think I agree with you, but I think I'm still trying to figure out this budget process and the policy board piece and understand the difference, and that we don't want to be diving into exactly what staff and what buildings, but also want to be able to fully understand and defend a budget then when we come around to the spring each year. And so I think it's in the goals that we write, and at least it's giving me a little bit of clarity of thinking about that work at the retreat. But how do we consider our goals so that if it's coming down to kindergarten teachers versus other things, are we, do we as a board, do we have strong primary instruction board goal that we've clearly stated that, if something has to give, the numbers get tighter, the governor does this, whatever it is, that, we'd rather have less coaching or less innovation or less of something else. If we've got to give something up, that we're always going to prioritize, a certain class size, strong primary instruction, are there certain educational things ways that we need to state our goals that then, this is what I'm trying to understand, is this sort of interface between this information and the budget, and the way we write those goals seems to be that. So I think there is a little bit of a role there in how we maybe put this into our goals.
And also from like a high level perspective, it's hard to explain the equity when you have this much variability. Like if we're really pushing for equitability across the board, it's really hard to then say and try to explain to somebody like the variability in there. So I think maybe this is more of just an educational piece that we need to inform the, parents and stuff about, this variability in kindergarten.
Well, I'm going to inform anybody right now because we honestly do not know what these numbers are
Oh,
going to
no,
be.
no, I mean high level going forward, like in the
Right.
budgeting process.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
these are these are areas of uncertainty, like maybe
Mhm.
call that out a little bit more. It's harder to pin these down, that type of thing.
Right.
I mean, I can't remember if we said this here last month or if we said it at another meeting. Like, what we did during the budgeting process, we kind of sensed that there would be a problem in Williston, and so we enacted some risk mitigation and we set aside an extra teacher. We said it was gonna be 5, but we had an extra teacher for 6, and then the projected numbers came in and the risk management process worked. So that's that's kind of the process and how we planned it, and then it worked out that way. So I think like in the future, if we continue to use that process with the NASDAQ data or something else that's more reliable.
Yeah, I was gonna say other data.
Yeah. We can continue to do that. I think it'll work out. Maybe if Greg could stop attracting so many kids to Williston.
Stop building the condos.
Yeah. Yeah. Brendan, you had some.
I think one of the things too here is that as a board, we still need to work on the definition of equity and what it means to us. And I think that numbers are not, you can't look at numbers and say this is equitable or not because the numbers match. Because there may be more resources needed in one class for many different reasons to make that class equitable to another class that might have 20 kids in it. So I think that, one of the things I'm hopeful to do at the board retreat is to really decide what that equity means and how are we going to move forward with that to give all the schools their individuality, but have equitable student experiences throughout the school.
We'll get there. I think what we're all talking about is really, class size, it's all, what is it that we want for our kids at the end of the day? What is that big outcome? And it could be that class sizes of 40, maybe not, could get you the same outcome as class sizes of 15. It doesn't matter, how am I going to say this that doesn't sound, we should focus on the outcomes that we want for our kids and making sure that we're meeting those outcomes. And this is just my perspective. The administration and our educational leaders are the ones that we should task with figuring out the best way to get that. And then it's our job to hold them accountable that they're meeting those goals. If they can do it with class sizes of, 18, 20, 25, that's great. I take your point though, Russ, that, at what point is too low? We always seem to talk about the high and the too low, but I would leave that to the administration to figure out. And that's the policy piece. I'm sorry, Jocelyn, I jumped in.
So at the committee meeting 2 weeks ago, we talked about this, and so I wondered if we could go to the next slide, because one of the things that we had discussed was exactly what Lynn was talking about before, with regards to, is it really that we should be managing as a board, like what the class size is, or do we leave that to like the administration? And do we feel like this policy is right, or is it something that we need to change? And I know part of the conversation that we had was what threshold in kindergarten, like, is a class size of 15 shown to have better outcomes than a class size of 20? And I think that the information that I was understanding was that the data showed that less than 20 didn't actually have a better outcome. But I may be wrong with that, but that was my understanding from the discussion. And so I wonder if it makes sense for it to be something that we talk about during the retreat about, I think it does go back to our definitions of equity, like what is the board's definition of equity, and how do we make that a goal, and then how do we know that it's actually happening instead of managing all the very minor details of it, I guess.
Okay. Was there more to that? Does anyone else have?
That was a good summary.
That was
I'll
a-
write it down. That and focus on strong primary education.
Is that what you wrote down? Is that what you said, Erin? Because I think that's a really good, that's the kind of goal that.
The only thing I see in this policy and in the guidelines is like the anomaly of a single class that's much larger than its adjacent classes. And you look at, I think it's 6th or 7th grade in Shelburne, and it's 2nd or 3rd grade in Heinsberg, where the average of the 3 grades, puts all the kids in Heinsberg at K1 at 15 with 4 teachers, but in 2nd grade, they have a huge number of kids, and the ratio is much higher, but because the average is over 3, so from K1, 2, 3, until those folks get out of 3rd grade, they're at a different ratio than the others. And it's like, I'm not asking for a solution to this problem right now, but it's like, maybe it's you just look at the data on the way out and you're like, okay, the outcomes are still the same through these slightly larger class sizes versus adjacent grades as they track through, and that helps solve you of that. But it is one sort of like, is looking at it over 3 the right thing? Is it having a rolling over 2? I don't know.
I mean, well, one of the things that plays into that is, like, you've got the classroom, that's the heart of it, right? But right outside the classroom is another concentric circle that is supports to the classroom teacher, and another, like there are concentric circles. And if you've got a small class size, it's possible that you structure those supports around it in a different way than the class right ahead or below it that has higher. I mean, I think that that's how you address that, because we're never going to change that some year there was a blackout and now we've got a lot of kids coming through or something. I don't know exactly what causes that, but I think that there are other things, and in a way, we talk about that. When we're doing our projects, we're thinking like there's so much more. Every single project you think, there are 120 things that connect to this that impact whether or not 20 is a good number or not.
And that's a great explanation that's not captured in this or the other graph.
Right.
So I'm glad you said that.
Thank you.
And there can be a year where they win the Super Bowl and there's a blackout.
Indeed.
2001.
All right, thank you. Isn't your own budgeting fun?
It is. Thank you, Jean. Thank you.
Okay, 7.0 discussion matter, 7.1, our 2-week-long retreat. So,
So, can I just say one thing? And this is me coming off my, I'm no longer the chair, but I interrupt all the time.
That's how you get to do that if you're
But
not the chair.
I lost it. I was like, man, do we really have to have retreats? And I was reading this thing, and I was like, effective school boards take part in team development and training, sometimes with their superintendents to build shared knowledge values. Because, okay, I guess we do. Yeah. Guess we need to do that. Number 8. Always read to the end.
I know, it was funny, so I get, it drives me nuts when we say we're a policy board, because I'm like, what the heck does that mean? And finally, somebody said, it means that we're not down in the weeds, we're like up at the policy level. And I said, oh, well, then we can just be an effective school board. So that's why I sent out that 8 characteristics of an effective school board, and I thought that maybe we could use that as a way to start answering the question, because, we've gone from a 2-hour retreat to adding more and more on, and we can't, I think in order for it to be effective and for it to be successful, it would be really helpful to get your input to that end of that statement. In order for the retreat to be successful, it will. So I was hoping that you all could provide me a little bit of feedback. Or not. We won't be successful if I get no feedback.
For the coming year. And only a manageable number of those. I was gonna say 80.
Anyone else?
In some ways, maybe it's an opportunity for, us as board members to float, our ideas, our priorities, and then to haggle over what ones are gonna win, or, what's gonna be at the top of the list.
Not only coming out with priorities, but those priorities that we choose have measurements. And how do we know if we're gonna be successful at the end of the year?
I would also encourage benchmarks like throughout the year, so it's not just like a long feedback cycle. Like maybe you can put in some benchmarks over the course of the year. And I'm not going to be at this retreat, so I can just load you guys up with work. Priorities to me is a little bit different than goals. Goals are kind of more maybe like a couple years out. Like we had the budget 3 years out, so I might have some long-term targets, like goals, objectives for a couple of years. I mean, businesses might call it a vision, and then shorter-term priorities as to how you might get there. Because without that, like, picture of clear focus in the future, what you're moving towards, it can be hard to organize and walk down the same path, or even where you're going. So I would encourage long-term goals too.
Equity several times, so.
Yeah, well, yeah. I was going to say, Brendan, I thought you were going to say.
Definition of equity.
Definition of effective board.
Pretty different ideas.
While you're defining equity, I might also define autonomy, because we kind of use the two hand in hand. So if you're gonna make sure you have clear definitions when we're talking about those. Trying to think if there's anything else I can offload on you guys. Stretch it out.
As a new member on this board, one of the things that I'm not clear about, and I'm not sure if this is a discussion for the retreat or not, but just it is the form of governance that this board is adopting. And so what I don't know is if there have been conversations and decisions made specific to that. We speak about being a policy board, but given that that's a form of governance, is that something that everyone is in agreement that should be the type of governance that this board adopts and moves forward with? Are there, and what does that look like? Just echoing what you said a moment ago, but that history of how did you arrive to this place to adopt this idea of being a policy board? I'm not fully clear about that.
Netflix movies on policy boards?
They're interesting.
How policy goes, or? No? Oh, Russ watching YouTube?
Yeah.
I think I find that we role play, each one of us role plays what we think a policy board is, and then for example, Russ says, that's a bad idea, and I go, well, I'm not gonna do that then. But I think, Jeff, I think it's not just that you're a new member and you're it's kind of nebulous. I think we're all trying to figure it out. So, I mean, it would be, I think that's one of the things that's come up the most over the past year is like, how are we gonna make this transition? And I don't think we're really micromanaging. We go down that road sometimes, but I don't really think we're
No,
getting that crazy.
but I think we find ourselves having to pull ourselves back from that. And sometimes there's a tendency, I know I, fall into that trap once in a while. You see something that's interesting and, you want to follow the numbers or follow whatever it is that you happen to like. And you have to say, wait a minute. So, I'm not sure I know what a policy board exactly is, but I've got some pretty good ideas of what it isn't. And that's, micromanaging to the building level or to the grade level and some of those things. So, I think it's gonna be an ongoing thing that we're gonna have to define. I don't know that we're ever gonna actually get there and go, wow, we're it, okay.
So we've been together for a year and we know what's worked and what hasn't worked in the last year. What about trying to develop, a simple paragraph or statement that is like our guiding principles? And that will help define us going forward. So when people have a question of, are we a policy board, are we this, are we that, we can refer back to that, but we can have something that we agree on that governs us.
We need a minute to do that before she leaves.
Yes.
Thanks, Amanda.
We're constantly, I think you're right, defining what it's not, but what is it? A
Like,
few
we have charters
affirmative
for every
statements
one of our committees.
of what we
And
are.
we have a charter
Yeah.
for the board.
Right.
I want to have fun. I just want to throw it out there. I don't know if anyone else feels that way.
It'll be successful if it's fun?
Yeah.
That's it? Okay.
The videos are good, absolutely. I agree with that. That's a lot for you this year.
Each person gets a bucket of golf balls during lunch. That's what Russ wants.
That would be fun. I'd be okay with that.
Golf, bowl, okay. Anything else?
I think that's a whole day's worth of stuff.
You do?
I'm very concerned that we are going to get sidetracked and not have the robust conversations we should. So I think we should have a fairly narrow agenda and really take the biggest issues that come up almost at every meeting. Are we a policy board or what are we? That's kind of the charter of this board. The equity and piece and maybe a few other things and really drive down and nail those out. I think that will help us in next year, work better as a board.
Everyone good? Okay. We're not gonna get off target. We're almost on time, sort of. Not really. We're getting close.
There's no time zone for discussion matters. That's why you're on.
Yeah, there is.
Oh, but action matters. We're a little off on that, okay. Anyways, all right, well, thank you. That is very helpful. 7.2, School Resource Officer.
I invited Adam to come to this because he's had some experience with school resource officer, but this is a board conversation. It's been in the news a lot. And people have come up with all kinds of ideas about how we might make sure that our schools are safer, and this is one area. But I didn't know if Adam, with your permission, ask Adam to, maybe share what his experience with a resource officer was in school prior to CVU.
Well, and maybe just a little context around where this is coming from and where we might be going with this. But
Well, I think that when Parkland happened, everybody started talking about what are the things that we have in place to ensure the safety of our kids. right? So simultaneous to Parkland happening, we had the issue right here in Fairhaven, Vermont. And I think that that caused lots of people to take a deep breath and realize, like, we can say whatever we want about all of this always happens elsewhere, could have happened right here in Vermont. And so that started the whole conversation about, like, are your doors locked? Do you have a protocol, 911 compliance, and SROs? Even before we started having the conversation.
We talked about this, you can't say SRO.
Oh, I'm sorry, school resource officer, you're right. But even before we started the conversation, as a result of all these things that were happening in the world, Adam had been talking to Jean and I about a school resource officer for CVU because he had a really good experience at Montpelier High School and saw that it could be something that would add value. So that's the context. I asked Adam if he would come tonight and maybe chat with us, and want to come sit up here someplace so that, yeah, sure, please do.
I don't want to say it's a Russ either. Adam listens to his father well. Yeah, so I began talking about school resource officer with Elaine and Jean quite some time back. And if you had asked me 10 years ago whether I thought there should be a school resource officer at CVU, I probably would have said I didn't think it was necessary, and I probably would have said I would have memorized the conventional wisdom about how a school resource officer might have a negative impact on school culture. And that was until I got my position at Montpelier High School as principal and had the ability to work with the school resource officer. And what I discovered there was that the SRO, just did that to dig the needle in, became a very valuable member of our leadership team in the school and was a huge resource for our students. And the model there was that the resource officer spent about 80% of his time at the high school and 20% of his time at the sending schools. And what I began to recognize was that the value added were a few things. Connections with families that often predated their admittance to high school. So there were long-term community connections with families that were really, really powerful. And I saw students turning to our school resource officer for support, just to have discussions in ways that the students weren't even turning to school administrators, shockingly, or teachers. The school resource officer really just felt like kind of a part of our school community. I think the other piece that I began to recognize was that it wasn't surprising for students when issues would arise and we would work with our community resources and we would work with the police to work through those issues. And that for me was a surprise. It was strange coming from CVU. I think when I came back to CVU, I had this more of a sense of like, wow, sometimes this building feels like it's this spaceship that descended in the hills of Heinsberg, and our students don't always feel that connection to the larger community that I think they should feel. And sometimes they don't always recognize that if an action they might take in school, when it's detrimental to the safety of the larger community, there's a little bit of shock when we say, no, we're going to work with our community justice center, we're going to work with local law enforcement through this issue. And it's almost like the school is separate from the community, which I don't think is a very helpful thing. And in some ways, seeing the presence of a school resource officer and having that person be someone with whom kids could connect helped bridge some of that in some small ways. I will say that the success of the position, from what I've heard from around the state and my colleagues around the state, is largely dependent on who you hire and making sure that you have the right person there. And I think when you do have that right person there, you've got connections to external resources in ways that you didn't before. You have ways to communicate with other agencies in ways that you didn't before.
Not unlike what, some of the benefits that you get from having social workers that are from the Howard Center, from other external places. So I really changed my thinking about it and have begun exploring a little bit of what that could look like for CVU.
Is this position by definition a member of the Heinsberg Police Department?
Not necessarily. I think there are a few ways to approach it. I think if you talk to, if you look at some of the logistics, it makes sense to have them be a part of the Heinsberg, because you've got the support of the department right there. You already have Heinsberg supporting CVU, so there are some basic logistical things that make a lot of sense. I went and talked to the Heinsberg Select Board with Chief Koss, I don't know, a week and a half ago, and just, you know, we just had a dialogue about what it could look like, and even some of the funding mechanisms, how that could work. But I think there are a variety of ways to go about it.
Does it have to just be one person, or could it be two officers from different communities, like 50-50, if you were to split a full person?
I think there are a lot of models out there. I think when you're deciding on that, though, you just want to be, I go back to that relationship piece and that constancy of someone who you really can depend on, who the kids can get to know and depend on.
Can you talk how it looked? So you said they were 80% at the high school, and 20% they would go to the sending schools? So were they serving the same role at the sending schools, or were they that they did at the high school?
Yeah, some of it would be, I think in the sending schools, there was more of an educational outreach approach. So, you know, coming to classes, connecting with kids, but I mean, you know, there are also families that needed that support and were involved with the officer in other ways outside of school, so.
And was there ever a negative connotation to having a school resource officer in the high school?
I didn't hear it, and the school resource officer had been at Montpelier for a long time, so it was fairly normalized there. Yeah. It was Montpelier Police Force. What's that?
Did he hear his item?
Yes.
Do we know how many other high schools in the state have school resource officers? Is the CVU one of the only ones that doesn't, or?
Yes. Yeah, I would say that of all of the local schools in Chittenden County, I think we're probably the only one that doesn't.
I had a few school resource officers in the high school that I went to growing up, and, you know, they were so ingrained in the culture of the school with the students. I remember some of them more than I remember my teachers. So these guys, if you do it right.
Hopefully positively, yeah.
These guys, if you do it right, really do become a resource and an extension to all the other adults, administrators, teachers that the students are interacting with on a day-to-day basis. And that's not a reflection of my performance in high school.
We have one in Colchester, the similar setup, the high school, I think he's there about 80%. But they're on a 1 or 2, they're from the Colchester Police Department on a 1 or 2 year rotation, and then it's changing. And that, you know, some people have been, really made connections and been great with students, some less so, but it must be the deal with the police department, but it rotates quite regularly. But it makes me wonder about maybe even rotating between the town's police departments, although you want that consistency, but also to be able to connect with families, you know, Williston families, Shelburne families.
Can I say
Right.
something about that? So Colleen McKinnon, was she at the same meeting that you were at, or did she
Yes,
go
she
to a
was.
different meeting? So the way that she explained it to us, she said that at least the way the Heinsberg police were looking at it, they would pay for, like, let's say 20% of this person, and we would be paying 80% of this person. So there's probably not, you know, and there was some question about, do they even need 20%, right? So then you get into that business. So that makes it harder to say, oh, we'll rotate it around, because then they have contracts with these people. They have to continue the contract once the person moves on. So there's some logistics of this that we'd really have to be thoughtful about and You know what?
That 20%
Yeah.
come from Summit, that there's no school.
Right, exactly. Right.
I think there's some legislation right now.
Yeah.
Talking about school resource officers and, I mean, debating about what type of arms they could have in schools and, it's an interesting it's an interesting conversation. I mean, I'm curious, have you talked to students about it? Have you gotten their input?
Yeah, we haven't, we've talked about it at the Principals Advisory Council. I don't think Student Council talked about it at all. And we talked about it briefly in a faculty meeting. And I know the subject came up a few years ago when Jeff was considering it as well. And the message from the faculty was, well, is this already decided? And my message was, no, but kind of. No, it's not decided, obviously, but it's something that I think I think as a leadership team, when we develop real clarity around it, of course, we want to hear from the community, but I think when it comes to saying this is going to help our kids be safer, it's not going to be sending a survey out and saying, everybody, what do you think? We're going to do it because we think it's the right thing to do.
No, I was thinking more of like the culture piece, because I think that's the first thing a lot of people think of when you say, oh, you're going to have police in the schools. So I think of it as, what did you call it, Dave? The New York Times, it's basically a social worker with a gun.
Yeah.
You know, that, it's how it's all presented, and maybe social work with the gun. Sorry, go ahead, Kyle.
Yeah, just because I don't know, how does one go about going from being a police officer to a school resource officer?
What a great
Is there,
question.
because I feel like those are two very different jobs, so is there different training for it, or?
There is training, right?
There is training. There's also a National Association of School Resource Officers. I don't know the exact training that one would go through.
I know that this topic came up at the superintendent's trustee meeting a few weeks ago, because there was some people thinking about like, oh, well, we've got some retired people who could maybe come into the schools and serve this function, right? Because they've already been fingerprinted and they've already had firearm training and all of that. And I can tell you that for the superintendents, we believe that that first word school is really important, and that only people who really want to be school resource officers and who have had that training ought to be in our schools, not somebody because they've been in law enforcement and have been trained in law enforcement. So I guess that's the line we would take, and it'll be interesting to watch the legislation as it moves along, because you know, if we're going to be honest about this, and it really is about like creating connections with kids and having them understand the broader community, it doesn't serve any purpose if there's somebody there who doesn't, you know, whose first interest isn't
You want a security guard.
kids. Right, we're not looking for a security guard, exactly. We are looking for a social worker who also happens to have been trained in.
So what are you thinking for your timeline, like in your big picture?
I was just gonna make one comment about the culture piece.
Oh, yeah.
One thing that I saw that was interesting this year was at the Winter Carnival, we had police officers there for the first time. And it was, you know, soon after Parkland, and it was soon after some of the things that had gone down in Fairhaven. And the feedback that I got from the student body, one was they applauded and thanked the law enforcement for being there. And I had students come up and thank me and say, yeah, there were 1,000 of us in the room at the same time. It was wise to have somebody there. And so I think there's a culture shift right now where I think people are appreciating some of that extra support in the building. But I forgot what your question was.
What are you thinking, like timeline? What do you?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is budget, you know, it's going to be dependent on the budget. So we need to do some more work, I think, with the lead team across the district and also at the school. And just think, I mean, the logistics of the mechanisms, how would you actually go about it? I think we need some more clarity on that.
My question is, what is the board's role in this? And is this a discussion that we need to be having at a certain point where we're either saying, yes, we Adam clearly is in favor of this. Are we going to support this? Do we have to approve it? Or is it just something that can be, if it can fit into a broader budget number that we say, okay, next year the increase is X and he can squeeze it into his budget? If you can't tell by my questioning, I would want to have a discussion about whether this person is a cop or not. Some of the things I've read is that arrests go up in the school, and I'm not sure I'm a big fan of that. So I think that's really what we have to figure out as a board is what is the discussion, what is our role in this, or is this just something where we're being informed, we want to do this and we're going to squeeze it into our budget and this is how we're going to do it.
Do you think it falls under a school safety policy, a duty of care to students policy?
So you could certainly make that argument, sure.
Not saying that, I'm just trying to think of the context in which to bring it up. I don't disagree with you that I think it's a shift. I mean, we've always, I don't know, prided ourselves maybe, but maybe we're just being naive. But I do think that it does require, we made a resolution to the legislature on gun control. I feel like the board needs to finish the conversation on school safety. So I don't disagree with you.
Yeah, I think there's arguments on either side for this is a good idea, this is a bad idea, but I think I was with you on February 15th and February 16th, and I know that you were sort of, I'm not gonna say you were at wit's end, but you and I had a conversation and you're like, there's all these people here are extremely worried. We need some assistance. This is a resource that we could use. We don't have this resource. And, that was a really powerful conversation for me. Now, granted, the first few minutes of it, I was like, what the heck is a school resource officer? But then, because we're. It's an SRO, Dave. Not to make light of it, but, I think in education, or in school, in professional school board members like Russ and I are, it's easy to make up terms and come up with policies and make it complicated for the public to figure out, but this is a resource for the school that Adam has identified that is extremely important and at the possibly the worst time for secondary education for safety to our kids. We didn't have this resource, and I think it's really important to fulfill. I think we should make sure that we find the money in the budget to make it happen for next fall. And, this topic filled up my inbox for all of February. And like nothing else that has ever filled up my inbox, ever.
I don't disagree with you, but if it's great for 9 through 12, is it great for K through 8? And if we're doing it for 9 through 12, do we do it K through 8? And then we're talking, and school, kids' safety shouldn't be a money issue. But it does impact the budget, so.
We've had these intermittent meetings on Monday nights at 5:15 in the principal's office, and I think that I think the situations in high school and secondary education are more complicated. And I'm not saying that K to 8 kids aren't capable of this, but I think the relationships that the resource officer could form in a high school those are the preventive relationships that are gonna be the most beneficial to protecting the student body.
So what I'm hearing is that the board wants to have a further conversation. There are more questions to be answered on this. I'm just looking at, I feel like I need to either side, I missed this whole side of the room. We have two different, it's a passionate issue and there are different sides, and I think we owe it to everybody to have a further discussion on this. Because I think there are some pretty big implications all the way around. Am I reading that correctly? I'm looking at this side of it now.
Yeah. Yeah, that's.
I might try to put it in the context of overall school safety, rather than just saying this is kind of the shiny object that's the brightest. So do we have, okay, I'm really gonna get into detail, the weeds here. Do we have the appropriate locks? Do we have like maybe the top 5 or 10 things and greater context of school safety? Because there might be a better place to spend resources initially, and that could be in like 1 or 2 year plan. So rather than just jump on this as something that's missing, I try to put it in a greater context.
A lock
I'm done.
and other structural things don't create the relationships.
That was just
that
a
you need
terrible
to
example.
deter
Brendan.
somebody.
It's the first thing that came to mind.
Didn't we get an update shortly after Parkland about there was sort of a security audit going on? There was gonna be kind of a district-wide look at
Right, so
the
the
doors,
state-
those
the
kinds
state-
of
so- well, the
maintenance
state
things.
has done one that has been passed on to the state level, but as a district, we're also working through our own, which we even started before this all happened. And so we're hoping this, before school breaks, to have sort of a comprehensive path to what we think needs to be done and how. I do, well, I appreciate, Matt, and usually I'm a systems thinker too. This SRO is kind of a standalone, I could put a lot of walls up around this building and you'd still probably have a need for that, SRO. But just timing wise, I mean, I think you have, the board has, if the board wants to, you do have time to have another conversation in May. And then we could, meanwhile, Adam and I have a little work to do just on less about the money, we'll find the money, but more about how it would work. And some options for the board to think about, I think.
Well, I think we also owe it to the community to
Have the
you know,
conversation.
if your inbox is full, and I know I got a bunch of emails in the short time I've been board chair on it, we owe it to the community to have an opportunity to have a voice. So I'll try this again. So are we thinking discussion in May, next month on this?
At this point, we don't have a proposal. We haven't identified a number of the things. Where is this person going to come from? Is he or she going to be a police officer or not? If we don't want them to be, then what are the options? You know, I think there's an awful lot that has to get fleshed out before you can actually go and offer somebody a job. So I don't know how long it takes and whether there's enough, you know, kind of models for this that, you know, you can just sort of, you know, grab one from here that you like best and grab another one from here that you like best and say, these are the 2 things that we're considering, I'm recommending this. But I think there's, you know, something like that has to go into this before, if the board even has to vote on this, which I don't know whether or not we do. And maybe we need to make a decision on that. You know, we don't necessarily make decisions on, you know, whether we're hiring a special ed director or not, or, you know, whatever it might be. That being said, this is something of a, you know, of a different animal and perhaps more sensitive than some things where, you know, it's kind of more traditionally associated with education than having, you know, somebody with a sidearm walking the halls here. So, I don't know where that goes, but.
I'm sure you have precedents. In my board service, there was always, the board had to approve new positions. This would clearly be a new position, but that could just been CVU practice. I don't know if it's policy or not.
No, I think that's true, especially above a certain level. This is
One, a unique position, and also of a high enough level, that would probably be a new position to be approved by the board.
You know, and to go back to our conversation of what type of board are we? Are we policy board or are we in the weeds board? So if we have to vote as a board, are we voting to either bring a school resource officer in or not, and then letting the administration decide what type of person is best for our facilities?
Just to throw my 2 cents in, not that you're asking, but I think it's important to answer some of the questions that Russ brings up. I mean, when you talk about an increase in arrests in schools, one of the agreements that we have with the Montpelier Police Department is we're not arresting kids in school unless there's something catastrophic that's happening and it can't be avoided. I mean, those are all things that I think are important to talk about because it'll bring calm around the issue and support around the issue. And just the other piece that, unfortunately, you know, the past few years, my brain has changed a little bit, where I go back to listening to what Rob Evans said, our school liaison officer, and he said, have you taken the reasonable steps to ensure safety? And that's something that I'm thinking about. You know, I'm even thinking about the fact, right now we're on public television talking about the fact that we don't have a school resource officer? Is that something we really want to publish? Is that, I mean, those are the thoughts, unfortunately, that we need to be having these days. I wish we didn't, but, you know, the reason I keep coming back to this conversation and trying to be careful about, man, I want to make sure that I'm not being reactive to national events and national news in a way that's not constructive for our community. But I just keep coming back to the question, have we taken the reasonable steps to put up, you know, the impediments to someone who would be thinking about doing our students harm, so.
Okay, so if I'm hearing now everything again, with more input correctly, the board does need to approve a new position. Ideally, we would like this position to be in place by fall. So realistically, we would need a discussion and then an action. So a discussion, and we got May and we got June. So it's not a whole lot of time, but.
Well, and I don't know if we know what hiring this person looks like. You know, how long does it take? If we're advertising a position, you know, we approve this in June and we start advertising it in, you know, the end of June or whenever it is, how long does it take to find and hire the right person? And what does that process look like? So they may not be by fall
No, but the piece that we have control over as a board would be the discussion and approving the position. We're not going to interview this person. So it's a
I guess I'm, maybe what I'm trying to say is I would rather take a little bit of extra time and do it right than feel like we're rushing into it because we have to have this position in place by fall. And you know, God forbid that something happened and we regret not, you know, being a little faster with it, but like I said, given what we know today, I would rather get it right the first time and not rush into this just because we say, well, we gotta have a warm body there by, you know, the start of the next school year.
Well, we'll start the discussion next month, I think, one way or the other.
I would just want to say, I really agree with what Brendan just said. I feel like our responsibility is to determine whether or not we're going to approve this position or not, and then turn that responsibility over to Adam to wrestle with who the best person is. And I just trust that if that person doesn't surface by September, then maybe it's December. But, and I'm not trying to think for you, but I just feel like this is really, I mean, my personal belief, given that, I just think we're so overdue for this position. We had a teacher killed in Essex Center just a few years ago. I mean, I find this, and I absolutely with job description, with everything, but so then the question is, do we have, what is our responsibility? Is it to approve the position and then turn that over to administration to then take it from there? Because I think it's hard, and that's what I believe too, because I feel like it's hard to then get to work on this without the green light that it's actually going to happen.
Okay, so, oh, what? I'm gonna get you a bell.
That would be awesome. So maybe, and I guess this would be my request ultimately, your decision, if we could have you back next month and to put some type of structure and give us a little bit more of an idea what this would look like in your mind, so we can have a targeted conversation. Because the longer we wait, you know, my concern is if we miss our timeline, school resource officers, you know, might be looking for jobs during the summer before school starts. So we don't want to delay this and then potentially miss out on a good candidate.
Yeah, I'd just like to say that after the conversation that we've had here tonight, I think we'll probably have a pretty similar conversation at student council this week. And if the board would like, Thomas and I could report back on how students are feeling about this during your discussion next month.
That'd be great. That'd be very good. Thank you.
Individual students should write well-crafted emails and send them.
It's Dave Connery at CVSD. Adam, does that work? Does that work for you? Okay, that's our plan. Thank you very much. Okay, before we get to action matters, because we have only one action matter to replace Amanda, who is leaving us. So, you missed 3 meetings in a row. Mark, is there anything, did you have to do anything, Mark, when you, no? We,
I resign.
send me an Elaine email. Dave Connery at CBSV. When are you officially, like?
Saturday.
Oh, my God. Okay.
And you're here.
Well, we had,
She's here because now she's not packing.
Exactly.
It was a respite.
well, we do have something for you, but unfortunately, I did
No,
not.
I forgot it. I totally forgot it. That is what happened. I had it there. I meant to give it to Lynn today.
I was going to say, I forgot to pick it up, so.
You probably mail it to her because she doesn't want to pack it.
It is
It is in a box, so I will get your address, but thank you for your passion. Thank you for your unwavering commitment to the kids in Williston and CVSD. For your budget sense, for your systems thinking, you've brought a lot, and I've only been on this board for a couple of months, but those are the things that really hit me. So thank you very much. You're going to be very much missed. Thank you. So now I got to find a replacement. Okay, 8.0 action matters. 8.1 appointment of.
Wait a minute, you do have to find it, yeah.
We have to do the appointment.
That's 8.1 appointment of board members.
What's the board member?
Do I have a motion to appoint Kevin Mara as the board member for Williston, effective on Amanda's resignation? Is there a second? Any discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. 9.0 consent agenda. Do I have a motion to approve the consent agenda? Second?
Second.
All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. 10.0, next meeting dates. So we're going to do the committee meetings on May 1st.
With a meeting ahead of time,
Hopefully,
5 minutes maybe?
well, right, there'll be a board action item ahead of time, and there's a potential for some school board training on discipline hearings. We're trying to schedule that for that same night at 5 p.m. on May 1st.
Which is the day after one of our disciplinary hearings on April 30th.
Yeah, that might get changed. That might be changed. April 30th. We have, on May 8th, it's not on the agenda, is the dialogue with Elaine at 6 p.m. at CSSU, or CVSD in Shelburne. Dinner will be served. We have a regular meeting on the 15th, and then we have our retreat on June 8th, where it will be fun, according to Brennan.
As dictated by
As
me.
dictated. All right, motion to adjourn.
You and I have a bunch of stuff.
Okay.
And I need a clerk.
If you could fill these out, that would be great.